actually said no to the idea. And I was wondering what the thinking was behind your decision to refuse the merger, which looks prescient in retrospect.
Quite clearly, the limitation on competition that would occur when all of a sudden 4 of the biggest were to merge would have been obviously severe. Substantially, what would have happened is that you would have had, you would have had 6 big banks, and then what would have happened is that 4 of them would have merged. So then you'd have had 2 very big banks and 2 smaller banks, which would have been forced to join, and as a result of which there would have been, a severe drop in competition, but also the whole question of too big to fail came in. This long before it came in under the current circumstances. Yeah. And we debated this considerably, and we just did not want to find ourselves in a situation where within the Canadian financial system, our banking system was really run by banks which were too big to fail, with all of the consequences that would put on.
Because to give some indication of the scale, I mean, in the United States, we, even after the oligopoly, it's a controlled oligopoly, but about 85% of the deposits are with those 6 banks, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes, we do. And I think that, by the way, I think that there are benefits to that. That's one of the reasons that our banks didn't feel that they had to reach as far as U.S. banks or the British banks to do that. I also think it has to do, a lot to do, really with just simply acceptable practice. When you're in a smaller country, when you've got a fewer number of institutions, and everybody knows each other, I think that there is a far greater pressure on you to not simply to do the right thing by the law, but to do the right thing by the spirit of the law. And that was certainly the case. However, there is really a limit to what you called an oligopoly in that we are part of the global banking system. So you'll find Canadian banks, for instance, will obviously borrow from Canadian banks, but they'll borrow from U.S. banks, from European banks, and from British banks, the same as anybody else. And so I think that what happens in a situation, a small country like Canada, not open to some other countries, we've got the best of both worlds. We've got a very strong banking system. It does have very strong markets. For instance, mortgage, we didn't have to go to the same extent that they did in the United States, but at the same time, Canadian business has the world global banking system to draw from.
Increased deregulation. In fact, one of the largest lobbyists I recall was AIG, funnily enough, and I think that there was a move towards greater deregulation. And there is an argument saying that the Canadian banks were effectively saved by the bill. That if this crisis had extended or not erupted until 2010, that many of the Canadian institutions would have been badly exposed.
Look, there was a problem of asset-backed paper in Canada, but I really believe that the Canadian banks would have come through it. And I think this has to do with a bit of cultural differences. And let me explain. People often talk about, okay, you stopped the bank mergers, but I'll give you another story. At the same time that New York and London were engaged in this massive fight as to which was going to be the financial capital of the world, and the authorities in both countries were weakening regulation, not strengthening regulation. I remember a G7 finance ministers meeting where they were talking about this, and I said to everybody, we're increasing the capital requirements for the banks. We're not going to, not only are we not going to hold them the same, not only are we not going to decrease them, but we're going to increase them.
What are the capital requirements right now in Canada?
Well, they're over 9.
Oh, 9.
And
we can't even get them up to 5%.
And when we did that,
when
we did that, I did not get one phone call, email of objection from any of the banks. The fact is, and in fact, the banks are actually operate at a capital level, higher than our regulations. So that, which is why I'm able to give you the number. I mean, it was their view, and they were quite. I didn't impose upon them. I imposed on them a legal limit that they could that was required, but in fact it was one that they were surpassing and that they continue to surpass. And so I think what you're seeing is in Canada is a different perspective on what is acceptable, what is not. One of the reasons people say this happened is that the bankers stayed in control mostly of our banks as opposed to the traders.
And do you think this is one of the things that confused me until recently? For example, the late Jim Flaherty, who sadly passed away recently, mentioned that he was upset about the Basel III requirements, and he felt that they were penalizing Canadian banks to some degree. Presumably, he meant so because these the capital requirements being demanded by Basel III were not as high as the Canadian.
Well, there were a lot of things as part of this. One of the other ones is when there was this requirement of excess taxation on the banks to pay for all of the support that the Americans and the Europeans had to do. Mm-hmm. And basically, we said, look, we're not going to accept a minimum tax level on our banks. The fact is, our banks have operated properly. If you guys can't run your own system, then you do what you want. Look, there's a real issue here. David Dodge, the former governor of the central bank, took a very strong position about the fact that Canada should not have to follow the mainstream who had messed up, given the fact that we didn't. I have a lot of sympathy for that, but there is another side of it, and I think this is where we're going to have to equalize things. At the present time, the Americans with Dodd-Frank are going their way. The United Kingdom in its fight with the Eurozone is going its way, and the Eurozone, of course, is doing its thing. And I do believe that there has to be much more coordination between the different banking systems. Not that countries like Canada, who are functioning well, have to follow somebody else's mean. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, if there isn't greater coordination, we're going to find ourselves in a situation in 10 years where when the Chinese banks, which are among the largest banks in the world, who have then by that time penetrated the US market, penetrated the European market, get themselves into trouble. And if you don't have coordination, how are you going to impose upon these banks the same kinds of rules that are not going to give you a great deal of difficulty? And I think we've got to understand, China's going through a credit crunch right now. Mm-hmm. It has got excessive credit. I think that the world, and this is an important thing for the G20, is going to have to come together and understand, without imposing dumb rules on countries like Canada, that we can establish a coordination whereby we can ensure ourselves that the global banking system doesn't bring us all down.
Do you think these dollar swap facilities that were established between, say, the Federal Reserve, I think the Bank of Canada is involved with that, the Bank of Japan, the Swiss National Bank, Bank of England, and the ECB, that seems to me to be an important step in that direction?
Well, it's without any shadow of a doubt. And in fact, I don't think that we would have had the massive reserve buildup in some of these other countries that everybody complained about, as an example, if we had these kinds of swap facilities much more. You talk to the Koreans. The fact is that during the Asian crisis, the Koreans didn't have access to these swaps, and so what they had to do was build up huge reserves, which they have done. And then they had to force these kinds of swaps once the G20 was created at the leaders level. So there's no doubt that these kinds of swaps work. The problem was that they were far too limited. I think it has. I think there are solutions. I mean, obviously the Canadian government operates a mortgage guarantee problem and it is insisted upon it. Did not get into the same kind of difficulties that occurred in the United States. Mm-hmm. Look, I understand the point you're making, but I also think there are other reasons for why Canada succeeds. We do not have a plethora of supervisory agencies.
You have a unified regulator.
We have OSFI, the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, who has the power to do it, and there is no possible way in which you can interfere with her. I'll never forget when I first became the Minister of Finance. She was in our building, with the finance building, and I went one day and I got on the elevator, and the Deputy Minister got on without by accident and said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going down to see the head of OSFI." And he said, "Minister, you can't go see her alone." Mm-hmm. And so he came along with me. And so I used to meet her in the elevator. So I think that the fact that we have got a much more uniform and a coherent way of dealing with these kinds of things, and we do really keep it independent of political pressure, I think is probably very beneficial.
Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and go to the question of income inequality. It's become a big issue in the United States, but I've noticed, looking at some of the statistics, that it also seems to be a problem in Canada, albeit to a lesser degree. What are your thoughts on this?
I think we all agree that the free market is by far the best way to grow an economy. It's by far the best way to have innovation. And I think we also recognize that innovation is what creates the kind of wealth that in fact allows us to benefit our populations. But clearly, an unrestricted free market, which we've never had. I mean, we have courts are there to protect big business as much as they are to protect anybody else. An unrestricted free market isn't going to work. But I really believe that the failure is one that has taken place at the other end. The essence of the free market is that it's free for everybody, and that if you're born not to privilege but to poverty, that you have the chance to come up. And the social programs are incredibly important for that. Free education, which was first introduced in the United States, universal education, absolutely crucial. I believe our healthcare system is an essential part of that kind of thing. And the kinds of, what we have now spent is so much time in all of our countries putting the emphasis of our social programs on the aging population, and that we have forgot the younger population who've got to raise a family at the same time as you know, pay off a mortgage, at the same time then send their children to college, and that we've forgotten about them. And the middle class is disappearing. It's disappearing, there's no doubt about it, because of this excess concentration of wealth, which I think should be dealt with.
How do you think we deal with it?
Oh, I think taxation.
Thanks.
I think taxation, but I also think, by the way, that it is something else. Listen, I mean, I think that the salaries that are being paid, when executives are paid, forget about taxation, just when the salaries that are being paid to the senior executives who are not entrepreneurs, who are employees of these large companies, most of their shares being held by pension funds, by ordinary Americans or ordinary Canadians, and when we allow that massive gap in terms of the multiplier effect on salaries, the difference between the senior executive officer and somebody at the bottom, I just think is wrong. Mm-hmm. And that you know, there should be a circumstance where in fact decency, you don't need laws to impose decency. So I think that is a substantial part of the issue. But the other issue is, just to give you an example, from the United States. In the United States, to be talking about entitlements, I'm not saying that entitlements don't have to be controlled, but be essentially talking about entitlements which are designed to help the poor rise above poverty, and at the same time protecting some of the incredible loopholes that benefit the rich, I just think is crazy. And from if you don't want to talk about it from a moral point of view, which is what I think you should, then I think that the wealthy should be talking about it preserving their position. Yes. Sooner or later, it's going to come to an end.
Yeah, I would agree. One last question. There was an article recently in the New York Times, because you've been a big advocate of Kyoto and also the green economy.
Well, I think Keystone should go ahead. I think the arguments against Keystone do not hold up. The oil sands are going to be developed with or without Keystone, on the one hand. On the other, and second of all, anybody who has simply watched the headlines in the past 6 months cannot say that moving oil by pipeline isn't a safer way than moving them by rail. Mm-hmm. So that is going to be moved. For heaven's sakes, let's do it in the best way possible. What is not really showing up, because fundamentally the Canadian government has almost put itself in the position internationally that it's a climate change denier. That's not the Canadian position. Canadians are as worried about climate change as anyone else. The Arctic is part of our territory where we see what is happening. But what is really interesting is that the Alberta government supports a carbon tax. The oil industry in the oil sands supports a carbon tax. The fact is that the main players are very environmentally conscious. I spend a lot of time in the oil sands working on behalf of the Aboriginal peoples, and there is a major coming together in what has to be done, what kinds of assessments there are. The failure is the federal government, and it's unfortunate because that's really hurting us in this whole debate.
Paul Martin, thanks very much for spending the time with us today. I wish we had more time to discuss it, but you had a fascinating and illustrious